Good morning and welcome to the next in the PMI webinar series. Welcome to you all. It's great to be learning about something that is non-COVID-19 related. It's been a very popular session and we've got lots of people who've registered to participate. The PMI has been a major supporter of this initiative, and we've watched its progress as it's developed. And we have been lucky enough to have a number of sessions over the years, keeping you all informed about what is happening. One of the most notable sessions was when we had people from various countries even updating us on the lessons that they learnt in rolling out a pensions dashboard. And I think it was last October, November time when we had an update from MAPS at our Pensions Tech and Admin Seminar on how they were planning to roll out the delivery of the pensions dashboard. So it's great today that we are going to get an update on how things are progressing. Our speakers today, we have Chris Curry, who is, I'm just checking, because I'm going to get this wrong, who is the principal of the Pensions Dashboard Programme, and he will be giving us an update. I believe he's going to be doing updates on a 6-monthly basis. We also have Richard Smith, who is industry lead at the Pensions Dashboard Programme, who will be setting out some of the scoping requirements. And finally, we have Chris Connelly, who's representing PASA, as he is the chair of the Dashboard Working Group. And he will be giving us some explanation about the depth of the data requirements. The idea is that we will have a session running for about 45 minutes of slides and presentations, and after that we will be asking the gentlemen some of your questions. If you look to the right of your screen, there is a question mark, so please feel free to type in your questions and I will ask as many as I can at the end. So over to Chris Curry.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Lesley. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much to the PMI for arranging this session and for allowing us to talk to you all and to bring you up to date on where we are on the Pensions Dashboard Programme. I'm also in the very capable hands of Richard, who is going to be driving the slides for me. So just by way of introduction and to bring everyone who may not have had a chance to work with the programme up until this point, to bring you up to speed on pensions dashboards. The industry delivery group, which then became the Pensions Dashboard Programme, was set up last year in the Money and Pension Service. We started last summer, building on the work which has been happening since 2015 and the Financial Advice Market Review to start to deliver pensions dashboards in the UK. As Lesley mentioned in her introduction, that pensions dashboards exist in other places in the world, but we've never really had a pensions dashboard system in the UK. And so the Money and Pension Service has been tasked with delivering the infrastructure and ecosystem to allow pensions dashboards to exist. We've done quite a lot in that first year. So we've set up the industry steering group with representatives from the pensions industry, from the financial tech world, and also from the consumer side, consumer interest groups, to make sure that all of those groups are represented in the construction of the dashboards going forward. We have also recently, last month, published an update on where we are. So if you want to have a look at exactly in the detail the progress that we've been to, please do have a look at that. And I think if we start to go through the slides, I can start to tell you about the work that was published back in April. So if we could move on to the next slide, please, Richard. Thank you. So as a kind of culmination of the first 9 months of work of the progress of the programme, we decided, we published 3 different documents just before Easter. As I'm sure you can appreciate, it wasn't the perfect time to be publishing anything, but we felt it was important to get information out there and to help people see what we have been doing, and more importantly, what we will be doing over the next few months and beyond. So there were three separate publications that came out. The progress report, I'll say a little bit about in the next 10 minutes or so, which kind of covers why pensions dashboards, why we're doing what we're doing, exactly what pensions dashboards will be and try to achieve, and who we're going to be working with. There are also two other more technical papers that were published, two working papers, which in turn Richard and Chris Connelly will talk you through, both really relating to data. And one of the themes I think through the rest of this presentation is how important data is to pensions dashboards, and why it's so important that we can work well with industry going forward. So if we can move on to the next slide. One of the most important questions I think for the program, and the one that we have to remember right the way through, is actually why are we constructing pensions dashboards? What is the point of pensions dashboards? And in order to do that, we really need to bear in mind what is it that they're going to be used for, and also who is it who's going to be using them. So really the consumer is driving the main part of the pensions dashboards program. We always have to bear in mind why is it that we need them. And if we went back to the government's consultation document in 2019, which is the starting point for the Money and Pension Service dashboard program, there were really, I think, three areas of objectives for pensions dashboards. And we've set these out here, and we use them throughout the documents that we're going to be talking through. Most importantly, the aim of dashboards is to help individuals find and view their pensions for a number of different reasons. We know there's a serious problem with lost pensions in the UK, and that although automatic enrolment has been incredibly successful in increasing coverage in pensions, there is also issues with the sheer number of pensions, the different number of pensions that individuals might have. So helping people to reconnect, helping to people feel a sense of ownership, and increasing their awareness is really the initial goal of dashboards, helping people to find and view what they already have. So that's the main initial objective. But actually just knowing what you've got about pensions is only the start. So actually dashboards should then try and help people to understand what they've got, either increasing their engagement, so pointing them towards engagement type of guidance or advice, and helping people to get support while they do that, so they can really understand what they've got. And then finally, I think the third stage of pensions dashboards, or the third phase maybe, is to enable individuals to make more informed choices about pensions. So you can see actually that we've also used those three definitions: the find and view, understand and act, in our data triangle, which I will leave Chris Connelly to explain a bit later on. But I think it's worth bearing in mind that kind of these are the different stages we're looking at, and very much our focus initially is on find and view, but we will then be developing dashboards to help understanding and finally to enable people to act so they can get a better outcome in retirement. If we can move on to the next slide, please, Richard. One of the reasons why the Pensions Dashboard Programme has become part of the Money and Pension Service is that obviously there's a very clear overlap between the user needs of pensions dashboards and the financial strategy that the Money and Pension Service has about increasing people's financial well-being. And there's a specific 10-year UK strategy which the Money and Pension Service is leading to try and increase financial well-being in the UK. And so in the progress update report, what we've done is taken the user needs and the UK 10-year strategy and turn these into some dashboard goals. So this is what we really want dashboards to be achieving when they are available to the public. So again, a lot of this is about connecting people in a way that's easy for them to understand, and again, really reflecting what we were talking about the understanding and acting. The one I'm just going to pull out there, which I think is worth mentioning, is number 3. So showing a comparable estimated retirement income for each pension, and something that will enable them to see the total income they might have to live on in retirement. And again, I think Richard will pick this up a little bit later, but some of the consumer research that we've seen shows that's really important for individuals And that's really what they're looking for, to enable them to get into the more detailed understanding and acting, is actually knowing what that pension or all their pensions combined will mean for them. But really, this is all about pensions dashboards. The objectives we're setting and the goals we're using is about contributing to people's overall financial well-being. But how are we going to do that? So if we can move on to the next slide, please. This just shows partly, in a way, just how complicated the whole system is likely to be from the inside when we're building it. Obviously, externally to an individual, we want it to look incredibly simple. All they need to do is to go through to a dashboard, and hopefully all the technology behind the scenes will do the rest for them. But I think we just want to highlight here some of the key challenges that we face and some of the key dependencies. So obviously, in the April publications and the presentation here, we're talking a lot about data. And while data is critical and probably the most time critical part of the programme, it's definitely worth bearing in mind that there are lots of other different things that we need to be working on in order to deliver pensions dashboards for the UK. So the diagram on the right-hand side of this slide just gives a kind of broad schematic of the different components of the architecture and the ecosystem for the pensions dashboard system in the UK. The key components that we are looking to be constructing: the pension finder service, and alongside that, the identity service, help first people to identify themselves and get verification, to provide some comfort for the providers that the pension finder service can then work with them to return the information back to the individuals in pensions dashboards, and a very important governance register which will help the trust within the system for all of those different data elements which move around within that system. But of course, there's a number of different things involved in doing that. And down the left-hand side of the slide, we've listed all the different areas in which we're hoping to make progress in the next 6 months, through legislation and rules, for example, through user testing, the verification and matching, working out how to calculate an estimated retirement income, developing the data standards, creating the architecture, and also, very importantly, working on the communications engagement and thinking about how we will be encouraging people to come to pensions dashboards in the first place, and how we can explain what they should be expecting to use them for, what they might be able to find from them. So you can see there's a number of different strands and elements of the work that we're doing in the pensions dashboard programme, which mean that kind of we can progress in lots of different areas along the way. But also, it's very important that all of these strands are interlinked to each other, and so we need to bring them all along in order to end up with a comprehensive and coherent system when dashboards are launched to the public. I think what's also clear from there is that this is not something which the pensions dashboard programme will be doing by itself. You can already see on that slide there are a range of other agents and organisations that we'll need to interact with, not least dashboard providers and also pension providers, in order to allow the data to be seen by individuals. But also, outside of that, we have the Money and Pension Service itself, which is responsible for providing a dashboard. It's important to point out at this stage that the Pensions Dashboard Programme is responsible for the architecture and the ecosystem, but we're not actually providing a dashboard ourselves. We're expecting there'll be a number of different dashboard providers that we will work with, but the system will work with multiple dashboards going forward. But also, you can see we need to work closely with regulators, with government, with HMRC, for example, working on state pension information. And if we can move on to the next slide, it will just illustrate just how many different organisations we're likely to be working with and in what different areas. So again, while today, and with the data elements, we're focusing very much on how we'll be working and the input we need from pension schemes and providers, in particular around preparing data and matching individuals. You can see there are a whole host of different organisations and different elements of the project that we'll need to work on in order to take this forward. So this is set out in more detail in the progress update report. We are committed to doing a progress update report every 6 months. So we'll always keep you informed with the developments, looking both at what we've achieved in that previous 6 month period, but probably more importantly, what we're looking to achieve in the following 6 months. I think that's hopefully enough of an introduction to the progress update report to whet your appetite enough to go and have a look at it if you haven't already. I'm now going to hand over to Richard Smith, the industry lead for the Pensions Dashboard Programme, who's going to talk through the data scope working paper.
Thank you, Chris. That's great. Yeah, so as Chris has said, the progress update report is a general picture of the programme as a whole, but the two documents that myself and Chris Connelly are now going to talk about get down into the weeds a little bit on the specific topic of data. Two documents, a data scope working paper and a data definitions working paper. And just to really set out the status of these papers and what we mean by working paper. A number of you have already written to us on the programme expressing your interest. We did a call in August, I think, for expressions of interest, or EOIs as we call them, to help with the programme. And over 200 people from the industry and across fintech and pensions and consumer industry have written in. So thanks very much for that. If you are one of those, you'll have known I wrote out and did a blog update in February saying we hope to do a call for input on this data thinking. And we were all ready with questions in the documents asking the industry what they thought, just as lockdown started. So we had a joyful couple of weeks at the end of March, taking all of those questions out because we just didn't feel, or government as a whole didn't feel, it was appropriate to add extra burden onto the industry at this time. But we have undertaken, and this is set out in the papers, that we do want to do a formal call for input on the thinking. But if organisations have the bandwidth and appetite to read the material now and to provide informal feedback, we'd be very happy to hear that. And doing these webinars is part of that process if you'd like to feed in. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about the data scope working paper, and then hand over to Chris to talk about the data definitions working paper. Just thinking for a minute to set the scene. If you think about what dashboards are, really they're just enabling our fellow citizens in the UK to see their own data, the same data they can already see on benefit statements, that's held by the pensions community in which we all work. So really the communities we need to really think about here are citizens or individuals or users, and then the pensions community. So a couple of words about those landscapes to set some context. Looking at the pensions world first, this is a diagram that will be very obvious and familiar to folk on the webinar. We pinched it from the Pensions Commission report in 2004, when there was a very good sort of laying out of the pensions subsectors of the industry. We've broadened that to cover all entitlements, because when we think about pensions dashboards, the individual, the man and woman in the street, doesn't really know what they've got, and we need to think about every single pension entitlement they could have. So here we're looking at pensions constituted in various ways, either by statute or by trust or by contract, initiated in various ways, either by government or through employers, through the workplace, or individually. And of course, the third row at the bottom there, the type of provision, whether it's some sort of defined benefit or some sort of defined contribution arrangement. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but suffice to say that we need to think holistically. And of course, all the differ quite dramatically in terms of age, and some of these sectors are growing in terms of the number of pension entitlements that exist within those subsectors, and some are diminishing. Obviously, master trust is growing very, very fast now with auto enrolment into some of the large master trusts, for example. That's sector 9 on this slide. But also, of course, data quality varies across all those sectors as well. So we really need to think holistically across all those sectors if we're going to bring comprehensive coverage to our fellow citizens. And I think one thing that comes out really importantly is the need to be consistent, and this that has come through in data standards, and this comes out from the international evidence. And Lesley mentioned the international precedent. So we were on a call with Belgium just recently, and they said the importance of having language that can be applied across the whole pension sector. And of course, PMI does the wonderful pensions terminology booklet, but even that doesn't completely work across all of these sectors. So I think, if you're someone who's had your career with a life insurance company, perhaps at the right hand end of this diagram, you would in your daily life use sort of quite different language from if maybe you're working in one of the large public service pension schemes in, say, sector 3 on this diagram. So this, for the first time, dashboards doesn't just bring together pensions for the citizen, it sort of for the first time brings together all of our pensions world. So that's something we really need to be very mindful of. The second community was users, or our fellow citizens. What do we know about that community? Well, we've got a lot more to do, much more to do as a program and as an industry to understand users' needs. But what we know already was some research carried out from the previous dashboards projects, the major one being the prototype that was developed in 2016-17, and there was some research commissioned by the Money Advice Service and the ABI in the summer of 17. And what that showed, and I think I've seen a question coming up actually about should we wait for completeness? What came out very strongly from that research was that users will have a low tolerance for an incomplete dashboard and would rather wait until the majority of providers, and for providers read schemes or providers, are online. And then moving on to the second, sort of builds on that, about the need to set expectations about what users can or are able to do on dashboards, both now and then in the future, and why certain providers are not online. And it was great. I was lucky enough to witness this research. This was sort of, the one-way mirror research, when you sort of observe the subject being interviewed, and there was a sort of anger actually. If one of my pensions isn't there, what is that scheme trying to hide by not exposing the pension on the dashboard? So it's not just a wanting there to be completeness, but a worry if it's not complete about what the missing pensions, what's trying to be hidden. So that's something really to understand there. But I think what I would say though, coming out there, is there's not a huge demand for dashboards amongst the user community until they see it. And certainly the interview subjects I saw being interviewed really were bowled over when they saw the prototype, thought, gosh, I need this. And that really leads on to all the supplementary questions. So as soon as they see that such a thing exists, there's a lot of extra questions about, well, what's it going to mean for me? Have I got enough? Should I consolidate? Should I look at my investments? So this is where this expectation management needs to come in, about what dashboards will enable individuals to do initially and then in the future. And Chris will talk a little bit about the very defined scope of initial dashboards. Coming on to the primary need, what came out very clearly, point 3 here, is individuals want to see information that's going to help them. And the core element, and Chris has already alluded to this, is an understanding of what this might mean to me in terms of an income in retirement. We are very, very alive to the simplicity of that statement and the challenge of achieving that. And this is one of a number of really important challenges. But I think as an industry, we have to try and find a way to help citizens get that level of understanding. Because of course, most folk haven't got a clue. I mean, if anyone's ever sat in on a pension-wise guidance meeting, for the over 50s who've got DC pots, it's so illuminating how little most folk know. And in fact, that's the learning point for me as a PMI member of over 30 years. You sort of have, with dashboards, you have to stop thinking as a pensions person and start thinking as an individual. In man and woman in the street, most of whom know very, very little about pensions. They don't know they've got DB, DC. They don't even really know what DB, DC means. All they want to really know is the amount of income they might get in retirement. So that's a challenge we've really got to look at very strongly, and we're very alive to the challenges there. Chris will talk a bit more about that. Finally, and building on that point 4, what was really illuminating, and this is the slightly earlier Alpha project in 2016, folk tended not to notice the difference between different financial figures shown. So if it was a per year or per annum income or a DC pot value, they didn't tend to notice that those were different values. So for example, if you put a 9,000 per annum state pension figure up against a £10,000 DC pot, a lot of folk think they've got £19,000. So we've got a big stretch, we've got a big journey to travel on in terms of helping folk understand that. So those are the context we wanted to lay out in terms of the complexity of the pensions industry and the early knowledge we have and insight we have about user needs. So given all of that, how would you bring all of pensions to a dashboard or make them available to a find if an individual wants to try and find all their pensions? So we brought to the steering group, the Pensions Dashboard Programme steering group in the spring, this diagram on the right, which is also a set of options about how you might bring all the data to be available for dashboards. I should say option 4, which is deep data and broad coverage across all the different pension sectors, is really into the future. That's the sort of the future that Chris was alluding to in terms of the period after initial dashboards. Option 1 was saying, well, suppose you just had some focused data, some relatively shallow data, but for not all sectors. Option 2 was saying, well, suppose you could go deeper into some of those data sets, but again, not for all sectors. Or option 3 was saying, well, no, let's stick at some focused data, but across all sectors. And option 3 was the one that the majority of the steering group felt we should be proceeding with. And we've got a few bullets there about why. It's easy to communicate. If you're going to have different levels of data available, or not all pensions data available, not all pension sectors available, it's quite difficult to communicate with a particular sector of the working age population about which pensions they can or can't expect to find. Of course, it places the same burden on all schemes and providers. And crucially, from a programme point of view, it will facilitate this sort of onboarding and regulation in a reasonable time frame. And critically, it will enable us to test and prove the 2 core elements that Chris has alluded to already, the finder service and the identity verification service. I won't talk more about those, but those are some core elements of the service that we need to get up and running. So government has said find and view is the initial scope, and we're saying it needs to be across all the sectors. So we've got one rather complex diagram, and this is my last slide, which tries to bring all of that together. The numbers aren't very clear here, but on the left-hand side, we've got percentage of pensions. We think they're somewhere, depending on how you count them, between 60 and 80 million non-state pension entitlements, uncrystallised. Then you add to that state pension, and it means that individuals have got about, on average, 3 to 4 pensions each. Of course, there's a vast range there. Some have only got, state pension, and some have got a vast number of pensions. But on average, people have got between 3 to 4 pensions each. And also on the left-hand side here, we've got the percentage of all of those going up from 0 to 100%. On the right-hand side, the orange line graph, we've got the number of providers, so going up to about 40,000 pension schemes and providers that exist in the UK currently. So what this is showing is that if we are saying the objective is to get as many of those 80 million pension entitlements available to be found as quickly as possible, it would be the earliest staging providers and schemes would be those that would bring the largest number of pension entitlements to availability as soon as possible. And that's really why the blue line steps up quite quickly to get, I think, the largest few dozen schemes and providers would bring, a very significant proportion of all the pension entitlements to availability. So then we get to this blue rectangle. So the dotted blue lines are the staging window. So most folk on the call will be familiar with the staged introduction of auto enrolment, something quite similar here. That would be a staged introduction of compulsion to expose data to dashboards. But what's not the same there is everyone was focused with auto enrolment on the beginning of that window, October 2012, and then employers could find the staging date that was particular to them. From a citizen or a user's point of view, we need to be thinking more about the middle or the end of the staging window, because it's only once most providers and schemes are in scope and compulsion is biting on those that dashboards become usable to individuals, because most of their pensions can be found. So I don't know if you can read the wording on here, but this document's in the scoping paper, and this is what we really wanted to ask a question about, and we will be doing in due course. We've talked about a dashboard's available point, which is somewhere in the staging window when it would be appropriate to let most of the public know that dashboards exist, because most individuals logging onto a dashboard or their chosen dashboard could reasonably expect to find most of their pensions to be found. If you look in detail, we think it's somewhere between 40% of all pensions being available and 90% of all pensions being available. But I think that's a really moot point. We want to do a lot more consumer testing about what is acceptable. And remember that earlier finding that if I don't find all my pensions, I don't just feel aggrieved. Well, I don't just feel like I don't see them all, but I feel aggrieved about why they're not there. And there's also a worry about might people make inappropriate decisions if all their pensions aren't shown. So we've got quite a bit more work to do on understanding when is the point in this window about when pensions are made available. I think there's quite a lot more to say about this slide. I'm not going to do it. I think we'll have questions coming in. I think Leslie's going to be looking at all the questions coming in, but I'm going to stop there and then let Chris Connelly talk more about the detail of the data, and then really looking forward to coming back and answering some questions.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Before I go into the slides on the detail of the data, and I promise you I won't be going through every data item, so I won't be hearing you all logging off. It builds on work that's already been done, so we're not starting afresh on this. When the first proof of concept started, late 2016, and some of you will have attended those meetings when that proof of concept was demonstrated to industry in early 2017. We had a view of the data to get the proof of concept working. And then after that proof of concept finished, we spent the rest of that year, and that's when my team at PASA joined the ABI group to flesh out the data items that were missing from the proof of concept, getting into some of that additional detail. The data working paper that's just been issued just before Easter builds on that, and it's kind of where the triangle diagram came from, which I'll show you on the slides in a moment. It's really trying to understand that not all data is the same as each other. There are critical bits of data that are very important for certain stages. There are bits of data that need different approaches to being cleansed because of the nature of their data. And I'm going to pick up on some of those, not just list the data items in the diagram. So if you could go back to the slides, please, Richard. And move on, thank you. So some context. I know that word says constraints. I prefer context. So government's consultation was came out about a year ago now. And moving on from the previous research that had been done, including end user research, there are some certain things that the consultation concluded that we have to bear in mind. So offering the find and view function. So this is about setting, the key word here is initial dashboards. So this isn't the end game. This is the first public dashboards that will be available to the mass public. So being able to find where their pensions are, that's the most critical user need, as we identified. There are people who have lost touch with their pensions and need to be put back in contact with them. But equally, the early user research told us that it wasn't enough just to do a find service. They needed to be able to view what that estimated retirement income was, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Moving on from that, we also did not want to put more onus on the industry than they are already facing. So at a maximum, the conclusion was that you shouldn't have to put anything on the dashboard that you don't already have to provide for your annual statements. And therefore, because of that, it very necessarily won't be all the bells and whistles in those first dashboards. It will be a broad view of some of the key items of pension information. The other important thing to note from that is that whilst there'll be lots of ideas about how dashboards might evolve in the future, including making it the basis for performing transactions, that's not going to be in the initial dashboards. We are talking about a service that will bring all your pensions together so that you can see them. that would be the end of the functionality for that first stage. So that's the context. So let's have a look at the data triangle again, please, Richard. Thank you. So in those initial objectives that Chris Curry talked about, we had the 3 objectives. So A being data items for find and view, B being find and view and then understand, and then C finally being understand and then act on them. So we are looking at this data. The 5 layers we've got here, I'll go into the examples of the data in a moment. We have to remember that we have to think about data now because it will go hand in hand with the legislation that needs to be written in order to compel providers of pensions and schemes to give their data to the dashboard infrastructure. So at this point, we have to decide what is sensible and what can we clearly articulate to schemes so that they know what they need to be compliant with. So we've called that the mandatory items. And it goes down, as you'll see in this triangle, it's the matching data, which by matching I mean someone goes onto a dashboard. I put in all my details. I convince the dashboard in some way of who I am. I go through some kind of identification stage. We go through some verification stages. And then that pensions dashboard will issue a request to every known pension provider in the industry about, do you have any benefits for Chris? All of those pension schemes will receive that request, and they'll receive a set of personal data to say, this is Chris, this is his date of birth. So this is Chris, this is his date of birth, address, national insurance number, whatever we think might be in that matching data. And that's the data that you'll have to look in your records for to see if you have any benefits for me before sending that data back. So that's what we call the matching data. It's what you get to match on to know that that request matches somebody in your systems. The next level down, the administrative data, is that kind of find part of the needs. Is to say, yes, I've got something. Here's who the administrator is. Here's how you can contact them, and information of that nature. And then 2A is the bottom of the mandatory piece of this triangle, where as responded from the user needs study and also as a conclusion of the government consultation, we have to include a number. You know, how much do we think the estimated retirement income is? And of course, that brings us into all those conversations about how to present that, given that the way in which we articulate DB benefits is different to the way in which we articulate DC. So those top 3 layers are what will have to form part of the legislation to mandate people to provide that information. But we can't just stop there at the moment. If I were running a pure software program, I'd be thinking about all sorts of things about what's the minimum product I can get out and get to market. And it's not really about what's the minimum I can get away with. It's more about what is the minimum and the keyword viable product I can get to market, because the most important thing to me about getting to market is getting the feedback from the market to say, well, that's really good. I like that feature. I don't like that feature. Here's some ideas for other features. That's how software projects tend to work. But I also have to remember the context is that there's going to be legislation to mandate people to send data. So you can't be changing legislation every 3 months or every 6 months. We have to think about the full data set as much insofar as we can right now, so that people know what is initial dashboard, what is my legislative overhead right now, and then where a dashboard's going. So we go down to the next layers in the diagram. So we'll be talking about accrued entitlements. So some of those things might go a little bit beyond what you currently produce for benefit statements today. And then in section 3 of the data document, we've started to list some of the other things we might ask for in the future.
Right. Hopefully I'm back. I can't tell whether any of you lost me during that because my screen's telling me I got disconnected.
Sorry, we did lose you, Chris, but I think you're back now.
Okay, where did I get to before you lost me?
I think it was about 30 seconds ago.
Okay, fine. So I think I'll move on then, Richard, and we'll go into some examples of what I'm talking about. Richard, can you move the slides on, please? Okay, so talked a little bit about matching data. So I think this is the first data that pension schemes are going to really need to take a close look at and make sure they've got it right in their systems. This is, as I said, the personal data that we're going to use to match a dashboard request to your pensions administration systems to check to see whether you have an entitlement for the person making a request. And we've listed what those data items are proposed to be. And I keep on reiterating words like proposed and the fact that this is a working document. This is why we need to get people's feedback. So whilst we're not formally consulting at the moment, for the reasons Richard articulated, it would be very good to hear. If you have time to look at this and cast your opinions, then we'd be very glad to hear them. The second layer down is where we start talking about the data we send back to the dashboards. So it's details of the pension arrangements, confirming that there is a pension entitlement in there, and that will be as a result that we have successfully and 100% guaranteed matched the data we received in the first layer. The scope of that at the moment, one of the proposals is that this is for benefits that are not yet in payment. I know we keep coming up in this industry with words like uncrystallized, but that's essentially what we're aiming for. The thought and the thinking behind that is that people who are in receipt of the money from their pension are already engaged with it. They know what it is. They are receiving it. So this is an opportunity to focus initial dashboards on those other areas of the market, pensions that people have not yet claimed. We move down. Level 2A is what's been the bone of contention for most people replying to the data items so far. We said earlier that we're not trying to get pension schemes to provide any more data than they already do in their annual benefit statements. And of course, that brings us on to one of the first challenges of this, ignoring the fact that our personal data might not be clean. But estimated retirement income, more and more we look into the ways in which schemes communicate their benefits. Not every scheme actually puts an estimated retirement income in their benefit statement.
Eva,
so here,
come on, move.
So here we start to see some of the differences between the user needs versus the objectives of the program versus actually hitting the ground and seeing where the real data challenges are. The other aspect, of course, we split DB and DC here, is that even where pension schemes do perhaps project retirement income for DB schemes and project a future value or an estimated future value, it's not on the same basis that we project DC benefits forward. DC have very strict rules about how benefits are projected and illustrated, whereas DB is done differently and differently from scheme to scheme. However, one of my observations on all of this is that Pensions Dashboard hasn't created any of these problems. They already exist today. It's just that Pensions Dashboard is probably the first program where we have to try and start solving them. Some of you, I'm sure, will already have closed DB schemes and open DC schemes and already communicate with your members about how those benefits are perhaps different to each other, but they still provide an income in retirement. And of course, we'd be delighted to hear any great success stories about how well they have been communicated. We won't just be talking to administrators when we talk about data. We will be talking to communications consultancies, and not just in the pensions industry. We'll cast our net fairly wide about how do we talk to people about money, because all of that information will be useful. I always take the view that if you're going to design something, you can't start with the data architecture, but the data architecture is kind of the first thing you need to finish. So in identifying what the data architecture needs to be, we do need to have a view of what does the end result look like. so that we can test whether we are actually going to provide the right data to achieve the views and the visibility of the information online. I won't go so much into the next two layers. They are about the future, and as I said, we have to have one eye on the future. We're developing software in a fairly agile manner, but as I said, we have to legislate on the data that we want schemes to provide. So we have to find this balance between constantly evolving the usefulness and the features and the functionality of dashboards, but we can't go back to the legislation too often. So at some point we will start talking about other data, other entitlement data, and then at some point we will, of course, start talking about additional pension information, more information that allows people to move from that ability to view their pensions, to understand their pensions, and then to act on their pensions. So when the time is right, we will ask you some questions about this, but only when the time is right. But I know there are people out there that will have time to look at this information. Many of you have shared your time today by joining the webinar, so thank you for that. If you do want to feed back to us, we are listening. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you. Just muting myself. Right. It would be great to put together some of these questions after what was a very informative session. I think that during the sessions you've answered some of the questions that have been coming through, and they've been coming through thick and fast. And it shows the type of questions that we've had, that this session was really needed. I'm going to put my first question to Chris Curry. When do you think that you will know that the dashboard is ready for the British public to use? Because people are really wanting to know about this timeline.
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? And the one that, if anyone saw the Work and Pension Select Committee that we did back in February, was asked a number of times, and we are planning during the rest of this year to do some more detailed work and come out with a more detailed timeline, probably in the next progress update. I think what's clear that even though the vision of dashboards is quite simple, actually, as we've explained today, the process for delivering them is incredibly complex, and there are a number of different dependencies which are at the moment just beyond our control. There's lots of I guess technological delivery issues and questions, and not least there are legislative issues. So one of the fundamental things that we need for the dashboard is the data. In order to get the data, we need the legislation. In order to get the legislation, we need Parliament to be sitting. And at the moment, we know that the Parliament is quite understandably focused elsewhere, and just in terms of process and procedure, is likely to be handling things in a much slower way than it has been in the past. So unfortunately, we know that there's going to be some time before dashboards are available. We want to make sure that when dashboards are delivered, they are fit for purpose, they are robust, they are safe, they are secure, and that individuals can have confidence in using them, and they're not going to be disappointed when they use them. So taking all those into account, we are working on delivering up a more detailed timeline, which hopefully we can share with people by the end of this year.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Richard the next question, if he's still there. I believe he can hear me. Perfect, you've come back. And there's a lot of question about what is an acceptable level of coverage in terms of the consumer. So, and a lot of the questions are coming through, what is acceptable level of coverage for consumers, but how many providers do you think will be providing data for the dashboard?
So yes, apologies for my connection issues. Isn't it a minefield? This is probably one of the top topics, and I think what I'm perceiving in some of the questions as well is a range of views. We do know, as I alluded to, that a relatively small number, small number of dozens of the largest providers and schemes will bring quite a lot of the total number of pension entitlements to availability. But of course, for any one individual citizen, that doesn't really matter. What matters is for the individual citizen whether all of their particular entitlements are available. So I think there are a couple of questions saying about, well, you know, what do we think is the right time? This isn't a mapped view, but personally, I think we could be looking quite far towards the end. I've got a reconnection issue again. Nod if you can hear me. So this is what we need to test. Bear in mind that a number of the international dashboards didn't have compulsion. Some of the later ones did. So Netherlands and Israel did, but you know, Denmark and Sweden didn't. So they had dashboards for a number of years without complete coverage. But when we talked with, or when government talked with a number of these international examples, they said, well, if we did it again, we would have compulsion because you get more comprehensive coverage sooner. I guess the question is whether there's pressure to release dashboards sooner. And I think this is the balance we have to strike between getting something available relatively soon, yet something which is acceptable and doesn't form a disappointment that means perhaps individuals don't come back to dashboards, or B, as I alluded to, individuals might make poor decisions. So we've got a lot of work to do on that. I think that this is one of the key topics we'll want to consult on.
Yeah, it's the word communication keeps going through my head, and communicating to members, and it's really good that you have been picking up on the need for simplicity and communication and agreeing consistent wording, which is something our industry doesn't have. I'm going to move on to Chris Connelly. It's good to have you back. Sorry, we lost you for a moment. Data. We need data. Data is the be all and end all when it comes to that. So what are you thinking of as the biggest challenges, particularly as you've come out with this proposed data definitions? I know it's not the end. It is potentially going to change as you consult. But what challenges are you facing?
Certainly the first challenge, if we go down the triangle diagram again, the first challenge is that we know that not everybody has up-to-date and can be confident that the personal data they hold is 100% accurate. Lots of measures that we already have to live up to in the market test that we have data present. So I'm talking about things like the pensions regulator, common tests, checking data is there, but actually you can't be 100% sure that it is 100% right. And of course, you will have to be for pensions dashboard, because you'll be expecting to send data to dashboards that you have no legal relationship with. So you have to be 100% certain that you have matched the right person. You can look at your data, you can check your own data, but all the time that you are only looking at your own data, you can't be sure. You could go back and ask all your members to confirm that it's right. You can have some confidence with certain pockets of data that they're right. Certainly active members and pensioners, you might have a greater degree of certainty that it's right because you are dealing with them every day. There'll be a vast community of probably deferred members at the risk of overgeneralizing, that you can't be sure that you've got the right address. And actually in the state of our market, you can't even be sure you've ever had the right national insurance number. So there are all those key things that you can't really tell just by looking at your data. You have to go and look at third-party data to verify, or get the members themselves to verify. So there's a big project there for a lot of suppliers. And then when we start looking down the triangle and start looking at estimated retirement income, then we've already highlighted some of the challenges and some of the feedback we've already had from other people who have read the documents. You know, not every scheme provides a projected retirement in their benefit statement. We know that not every scheme provides bulk deferred benefit statements as of right. Sometimes they just do them on demand. So there'll be lots of challenges that different schemes will have to sort of provide that information, even though they're required to provide it if their member asks. Some people still wait for their member to ask before providing it automatically. So, you know, those are the kind of challenges that we have. I've noticed in the questions and the chats that some people do feel that we could make DC and DB projections similar. I agree, we could make it so. I'm just pointing out it's not so today.
If I can build on that, Lesley, I think I love PMI. I think someone has articulated one of the attendees articulated the core, the nub of it, the top question I can see. How will the dashboard or dashboards balance simplicity and accuracy? And I think there's a core paragraph in the data definitions paper that talks about this. Is we need to have something which is usable and understandable for the vast majority of our fellow Britons looking at their pensions, and yet it's underpinned by this vast, complex world in which we've all built our careers. So there's a sweet spot to be struck between simplicity and accuracy, and it's I believe it's only through engagement like this and talking broadly across the industry that we're going to find that appropriate balance. Just one other point as well on the calculations. I think I've seen a couple of questions about who's doing the calculations, and to be really, really clear, initial dashboards don't do any calculations. Every item you see on an initial dashboard will have been provided by a pension scheme or a provider, including the estimated retirement income.
Thank you. If we can go back to data, Chris, we've had a question about GDPR implications, given how much data could potentially be going back and forth. Can you give some comfort on GDPR?
Yeah, certainly. And I think this is another reason for why legislation is going to be so important. It's not just the compulsion to provide the data. It's going to give us that clear circle of trust that if we receive a valid request, in replying to a valid request, we are still within the law. So part of the identification and verification journey of a member going onto a dashboard, again, picking up on the point that the dashboard might have no relationship to your scheme at all, is that they will have proven who they are beyond doubt, and they will have made a request for you to send them their data through this channel. So in a way, it's exactly analogous to them ringing you up and asking for a paper statement. It's exactly the same as them going onto a website, logging in and pressing a button to say, show me my benefit statement. It's exactly the same analogy. So GDPR is an important consideration, but the user journey through the ID and V stage before it even gets to you will deal with that and close that circle of trust.
Thank you. Got an interesting question that's just come up, and this might be one that helps understand the flow of where the data is coming from and where it's going to. Someone has asked, will there be a flow, and this might be one for Chris Connelly, will there be a flow of info back from the dashboard to providers, i.e. change of addresses, etc., as many members have lost touch with their occupational pension scheme and many trustees are taking active steps to trace members? So almost like, I think they think of it as a portal to be able to send information out to all their schemes, or schemes that they already know about, or schemes that they've lost.
I think we'd be missing a trick as an industry if we didn't head towards that. Just won't be in the initial dashboards. The initial dashboards will be read-only, but I think it will be extremely valuable if we can do that. There are lots of challenges that exist today in the UK that aren't of dashboards making, but I think there are things we can resolve. So we've talked about other countries. I worked a little bit on the Dutch dashboards, for example, and it's interesting that they have an infrastructure in the Netherlands where personal data changes, addresses, all those kind of things are held centrally, and things like pension schemes and dashboards can subscribe to those changes. Tying it back to the previous question we had on GDPR as well, of course, there is a purpose for which you are holding and transacting the data that we'll have to satisfy. But yes, I think the future direction of travel, I would love it if this is the thing that solves our problem of having one place where a member can change their address and every pension scheme gets it at once.
Thank you. I know we're approaching the end of the session, but we've been informed we can have an extra 5 minutes. But for those that might have to leave spot on 11 o'clock, I would like you to know that PDP have said that they would be happy to share the slides, which we can distribute for you. This is also being recorded and will be available on the PMI Bright Talk channel. So if you have to go, thank you very much. But if you can hang on for another 5 minutes, there's still a few questions that we would like to I'd like to put to the panel. Chris Chris, there's a question been brought up that you've mentioned during this, the estimate of retirement income, but last October you said that the dashboard wouldn't include modelling. Have you changed your mind? And what are the legal implications?
I hadn't started answering then. No, Richard helped answer this question a little earlier. So when we're talking about the estimated retirement income, that will be an estimate which is made by the scheme or the provider. So the dashboard themselves will not be doing any changes to the data, any manipulation of the data, or any projection itself. So the dashboard will only be displaying the information that comes from the provider. And what that means is there should be complete consistency across all dashboards as well. So where you have multiple dashboards, they should all be receiving the same information and all be displaying the same information. So for the consumer, whichever dashboard they log into, they will get the same coming through.
Thank you. I'm going to ask this question because it comes up time and time again, is that why are there going to be multiple dashboards? Why isn't there just going to be one central one?
So shall I cover that, Chris, a little bit? Yeah. So government looked at this extensively during the feasibility study during 2018, and then put out the policy and the consultation in December and through to the April 19 consultation response. And the view being that one size doesn't fit all. It's likely that different consumer groups, and I think ABI have recently done some research, is that if you think people generally use facilities where they are, so it's likely, I think the ABI research found that 20 and 30-year-olds would likely use a dashboard which is within their banking app. 40, 50-year-olds might, I think the prevalence there was to use a pension website, so maybe a pension provider with whom someone has a relationship, that might be the place they would naturally go. Others might use the MAPS dashboard. So the sense is that you get better traction with the whole of the working age population who have different needs, albeit the data's the same initially, by having a multiple dashboard philosophy. I don't know whether there's anything else you want to add to that, Chris Curry?
No, I think that's right. It's just a factor of trying to get as many people to use dashboards as possible, and in a way, having dashboards in a number of different places makes it more likely that people will come across a dashboard. We're not convinced that a dashboard will be something that people actively go out and seek to start off with. Maybe eventually, but not initially. And so the more people we can get using dashboards, probably the better.
One of the things I would like to come back to is this fear that has been coming across consistently in some of the questions of the incomplete picture. And one of the questions is, how will people know that what they're seeing isn't their complete pensions pot?
It's a great question, isn't it? That's something we need to work through. I suppose I would say, what happens today? You know, how does an individual know today? You know, I've got 6 pensions. You know, how do I know that I'm in touch with all of them? So, you know, dashboards will take us further in helping the individual know they've got access or sight of their pensions. But I think it's up to us as an industry to improve the quality of our matching data so that we can talk with greater confidence that pensions will be found. We're undertaking some qualitative research, or we've commissioned some qualitative research with some schemes and providers to begin to understand this at the next level of detail. Because as Chris mentions, pensions regulator record keeping standards talk about presence of data, not accuracy of data. So just because all 6 of my pension schemes and providers hold my national insurance number, does that mean they're holding the right national insurance number for me? That needs to be explored. So I think we have a lot to do, and this is another reason why we're doing data early. It's the earliest thing, because if pensions aren't findable in the main, or ideally, you know, incompletely, then we should stop as an industry. But we need to work hard on that as an industry and look to ourselves to say, what can we do to make our pensions findable?
Fantastic. I'd like to draw this session to a close and thank Chris and Richard for giving us a really good update on the progress, but also a greater understanding of how it's progressing and what the stages of delivery of the dashboard are. We hope that you'll come back when you have done your next 6 monthly update and keep us up to date at another one of these sessions.
Very
So
happy to.
Very much.
I'd like to thank you all. I'd like to thank Max and Tanaz at PMI for organising it, and I'd also like to thank the audience for participating and your excellent questions today. The next PMI webinar, I believe, is on the 18th and is on changes to DB endgame. I'm afraid it's back to the effects of COVID-19. But thank you all, and thank you for your time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.